February 12, 1943, Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. Dawn did not bring peace. The rising sun stretched long shadows across the pale coral runway, painting the airfield in gold and silence. It looked calm, almost beautiful, but beneath that calm lay tension, thick and electric, like the moment before a storm breaks. 24 fighters stood lined up along the strip, dark blue, still, waiting. They were not just aircraft, they were something new, something the enemy had never faced before. Major William Gies checked his watch. 0600 hours. 2 hours. In just 2 hours, those Vought F4U Corsairs would take to the sky for their first combat mission in the Pacific War. Not a routine patrol, not a training sortie. This would be something far more dangerous, an escort mission. 230 miles deep into Japanese-controlled airspace, all the way to Vella La Vella. And none of the pilots standing beside those machines had any idea that this mission would mark the beginning of one of the most devastating air campaigns in the history of the Solomon Islands. The sky belonged to Japan. For over a year, the Japanese had ruled these skies. Their dominance wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. The Mitsubishi A6M0 had become a legend. Untouchable, unbeatable, a predator without equal. American pilots had learned the hard way. Try to turn with a zero, and you died. Try to outclimb it, and you died. Try to outrange it, you still died. Since Pearl Harbor, Japanese aviators had demonstrated superiority in nearly every aspect of aerial warfare: training, discipline, tactics, and experience. Many of them had already been fighting for years before the United States had even entered the war. In China, they had sharpened their skills against weaker opponents. They had learned patience, precision, ruthlessness. Now in the Solomons, they were masters of the sky. At Rabaul, the fortress base of the Naval Imperial Japanese Navy, the finest concentration of naval aviation in the Pacific was assembled. Hundreds of aircraft, hundreds of combat veterans, men like Saburo Sakai, already credited with over 60 victories, or Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, a man who would become one of Japan's deadliest pilots. These were not just aviators, they were artists of war, and the sky was their canvas. The American lesson. The Pacific War had already taught the United States one brutal, undeniable truth. Control the air, and you control everything. Lose the air, and you lose the war. American aircraft like the P-40 Warhawk and the F-4 Wildcat had fought bravely, but they had been outmatched, heavier, slower, less agile. They survived not because they were superior, but because their pilots adapted. They learned not to turn with the zero. They learned to fight differently. But adaptation alone wasn't enough. They needed something better, something faster, something stronger, something deadly. Enter the Corsair. The Vought F4U Corsair sat on Henderson Field like a restrained beast. Its inverted gull wings gave it a strange, almost predatory silhouette, a shape unlike anything else in the sky. It looked unnatural. It looked dangerous, because it was. Powered by the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, the Corsair produced over 2,000 horsepower, an enormous figure for its time. It could exceed 400 miles per hour. It climbed fast, it dove faster, and when it attacked, it hit like a hammer. 6 .50 caliber Browning machine guns lined its wings, capable of unleashing a torrent of destruction, hundreds of rounds per second. In just 2 seconds, a well-placed burst could tear an enemy aircraft apart. But raw numbers didn't tell the full story, because the Corsair wasn't easy, it wasn't forgiving, it wasn't safe. The U.S. Navy had initially rejected it for carrier operations. Its long nose made forward visibility during landing nearly impossible. Its left wing stalled before the right, causing violent snap rolls at low speeds. Its landing gear bounced dangerously on carrier decks. Pilots called it unforgiving. Some called it lethal. But those same flaws were also its greatest strengths. The power that made it difficult to control gave it unmatched acceleration. Its heavy, rugged structure allowed it to absorb damage that would destroy lighter aircraft. And in the hands of a pilot who understood it, it became something terrifying. The men who would fly it. Lieutenant Kenneth A. Walsh had only 25 hours in the Corsair when he arrived at Guadalcanal. 25. That was barely enough to understand the machine, let alone master it. But Walsh wasn't an ordinary pilot. He'd started as an enlisted Marine, a mechanic. He understood machines in a way many officers didn't. He didn't just fly aircraft, he felt them. He listened to them. He knew when something was wrong and when something was about to go very, very right. To him, the Corsair wasn't just an airplane, it was controlled violence. 14,000 pounds of power, fuel, metal, and fire, barely contained. Master it, and you held death in your hands. Rookies versus legends. The pilots of VMF 124 were young, most in their early 20s. Some had never seen the ocean before joining the Marines. Farm boys, students, clerks, mechanics. They had trained hard, but training wasn't combat, and combat in the Solomons meant facing the best Japanese pilots had to offer. Across the sea at Rabaul, Japanese forces prepared for another day of operations. The base was massive, 5 airfields, a harbor filled with warships, thousands of personnel. It was considered nearly impregnable, and its pilots believed the same about themselves. When reconnaissance reports mentioned a new American aircraft with bent wings, the reaction was almost dismissive. Another experiment, another failure. The Americans, they believed, relied too much on machines, too little on skill. It had cost them before. It would cost them again. Or so they thought. First contact. At 800 hours, the Corsairs took off. 12 aircraft climbed into the morning sky, escorting a slow, vulnerable PBY Catalina on a rescue mission near Vella La Vella. The mission seemed simple, routine, almost easy. But in war, nothing stays simple long. At 18,000 feet, the Corsairs cruised in formation. Below them, the Catalina lumbered along, exposed, a perfect target. And the Japanese saw them. Lieutenant Walsh spotted them first. 9 Zeros, climbing fast, positioning for attack. Bandits, 8 o'clock, low, climbing. The moment had come. 12 inexperienced American pilots against 9 veteran Japanese aces. The first strike. Walsh didn't hesitate. He rolled inverted, pulled into a split S, and dove. The Corsair came alive. Speed surged instantly, faster than anything he had ever flown. 350 miles per hour. The aircraft didn't just dive, it attacked the air itself. The controls stiffened, but held. Below him, a Zero filled his gun sight. Closer, closer. He waited, disciplined, focused. Then he fired. 6 streams of .50 caliber rounds converged in a single point. The effect was instantaneous. The Zero didn't burn, it didn't explode, it disintegrated. Wings ripped away, the fuselage shattered, the engine tore free, gone in seconds. Walsh pulled up hard, the G-forces crushing him into his seat as the Corsair climbed back into the sky. 1 pass, 1 kill. A new way of war. The other Corsairs followed. Dive, fire, climb. Again and again. No turning, no dogfighting, no mercy. The engagement lasted 4 minutes. When it ended,
3 Japanese fighters were gone, falling into the sea in pieces. The rest fled. Not a single Corsair was lost. Not one was even hit. Something had changed. Something fundamental. The rules of the sky had just been rewritten. Whistling death. Back at Rabaul, the debriefing was tense. The reports were unlike anything Japanese commanders had heard before. A new American fighter, faster, stronger, deadlier, impossible to engage in traditional combat. Within gaze, Japanese pilots gave it a name: Whistling Death. The sound came first, a high-pitched scream as the aircraft dove at extreme speed, air tearing through its wing intakes, and then destruction followed.
The fur, it was a warning, a crack in the foundation of Japanese air supremacy. At Rabaul, the report: pilot, speed, firepower, an enemy that refused to fight the way they understood war. The Zero had been designed for a different kind of battle, one of maneuver, finesse, and precision, but the Corsair was built for destruction, the tactical revolution. The change was immediate, and it was ruthless. American pilots abandoned the turning dogfights that had defined early Pacific combat. No more circling duels, no more contests of agility. Instead, they fought in the vertical. They struck like predators. Dive, fire, climb, repeat, boom and zoom. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't honorable, it was devastating. The Corsair's power allowed it to dive at speeds that would rip a Zero apart. Its weight gave it momentum the lighter Japanese fighters simply could not match. And most importantly, it could leave the fight whenever it wanted. Japanese pilots suddenly found themselves reacting instead of controlling, chasing shadows, climbing after enemies they could never catch, dying without ever getting a clean shot. Walsh learns to hunt. Lieutenant Kenneth A. Walsh adapted faster than most. He understood something instinctively. The Corsair wasn't meant to duel. It was meant to kill. On April 1st, 1943, he led a 4-aircraft division over the Russell Islands. The sky was clear. Too clear. Perfect for an ambush. And it came. 30 Zeros climbed to meet them. 30 against 4. In 1942, that would have been a death sentence. But this was 1943, and this was the Corsair. Walsh didn't panic. He didn't turn. He didn't descend. He stayed high, controlled, patient. Then he gave the order: attack. 4 against 30. The Corsairs dove in sequence, not together, not chaotic, precise. Each aircraft attacked separately, one diving while the others climbed, always maintaining altitude advantage. The Japanese reacted instinctively. They tried to climb, they tried to turn, they tried to engage, but every move put them at a disadvantage. At low speed, the Corsair avoided them. At high speed, they couldn't follow. Walsh made his first pass, a short burst. 1-0 exploded into fragments. He climbed, repositioned, dove again. Second pass, second kill. By the time the engagement ended, 11 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. The 4 Corsairs returned home. All of them, with only a handful of bullet holes between them. It wasn't a battle, it was a demonstration. The myth begins to die. For over a year, the Zero had been mythologized. Now that myth was collapsing. Fast. Japanese pilots began to understand something they had never faced before. They were no longer superior, and worse, they were vulnerable. Reports described the same pattern again and again. The enemy dives from above, fires, and disappears before we can react. Our weapons are ineffective against their armor. We cannot engage them in turning combat. They refuse to fight. The Zero's greatest strength, maneuverability, had become irrelevant
because the enemy refused to play that game. Escort missions became kill zones. Before the Corsair, Japanese bombers had operated with relative confidence. American escorts would turn back due to limited range. That's when the Zeros struck. Now, the Corsair stayed, all the way in, all the way out. Its extended range changed everything. Japanese bomber formations now required massive fighter escorts, sometimes 20 or 30 aircraft, just to survive. And even that wasn't enough, because the Corsair didn't need numbers, it needed position. And once it had that, it owned the sky. June 16, 1943, the breaking point. More than 100 Japanese aircraft launched from Rabaul. Their target, American shipping near Guadalcanal. It was meant to be overwhelming, decisive, a show of force. They were met by 32 Corsairs. The battle that followed would mark a turning point. The Japanese came in confident, organized, experienced. They had numbers, they had history, they had pride. The Corsairs had none of that. They had speed, they had altitude, they had firepower, and they had learned how to use all three. The slaughter. The Corsairs struck first, from above, out of the sun. The first wave shattered the formation. Bombers broke apart, fighters scattered, coordination dissolved into chaos. Then came the second wave, and the third. Each attack precise, relentless, calculated. Japanese tried to climb, stalled, tried to turn, too slow, tried to escape, too late. By the time the battle ended, 77 Japanese aircraft had been gone, destroyed, for the loss of just 6 Corsairs, a kill ratio of 13-1. It wasn't a defeat, it was annihilation. Fear enters the cockpit. Something new began to spread among Japanese pilots. Not doubt, not uncertainty, fear. The sound of the Corsair became a warning, that high-pitched scream in a dive. It meant death was seconds away. Pilots began hesitating, breaking formation, avoiding engagement. Some even refused missions when Corsair presence was reported. The psychological edge had shifted, and in air combat, that could be just as deadly as bullets. The machine versus the man. The Japanese had trained their pilots for years, years of discipline, years of refinement. They believed skill would always prevail, but the Corsair changed that equation. Now, technology amplified the average pilot. An American rookie in a Corsair could defeat a veteran Japanese ace in a Zero, not because he was better, but because his machine was. The balance between man and machine had shifted, and it would never go back. Walsh becomes an ace. By May 1943, Walsh had 5 victories, an ace, the first Corsair ace. His 5th kill came in a fight that defined the new era. Alone, outnumbered, 3 Zeros closing in. Instead of running, he attacked. 1 pass, 1 kill. Climb, reposition, dove again. 2nd pass, 2nd kill. The last Zero tried to force him into a turning fight. Walsh refused. He went vertical, climbed until the Japanese pilot stalled, then rolled over, dove, fired, and ended it. 3 enemies, 3 kills. Total control. The system takes over. Walsh wasn't unique. That was the terrifying part. Dozens of pilots were now achieving similar success, because it wasn't just about skill anymore. It was about system, training, doctrine, technology. American pilots were learning faster, adapting faster, replacing losses faster. Meanwhile, Japan was running out of time. The attrition war. Japan had entered the war with some of the best trained pilots in the world, but they couldn't replace them. Training a naval aviator took years, and now they were losing them by the hundreds. Veterans were dying, instructors were dying, leaders were dying, and their replacements, weren't ready. Some had less than 100 hours of flight time. Some barely knew how to fight. They were being sent into the sky to face the Corsair, a war already decided. By mid-1943, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Japanese air power in the Solomons wasn't just weakening, it was collapsing. And at the center of that collapse was the bent-wing fighter. The machine once rejected, the aircraft once considered too dangerous to fly. Now, it was unstoppable. The sound of the end. Japanese ground troops began to recognize the sound. That whistle, that scream, it echoed across islands, jungles, and airfields. It meant bombs, it meant strafing runs, it meant destruction. They called it death from above, and they were right.
The black sheep arrive. By late 1943, the war in the skies had changed beyond recognition. But one squadron would come to symbolize that transformation more than any other. VMF 214, the Black Sheep, led by Gregory "Pappy" Boyington. He wasn't the model officer, he wasn't polished, he wasn't disciplined in the traditional sense, but he was something far more dangerous. He understood combat, and more importantly, he understood both sides of it. Boyington had flown against the Japanese before with the Flying Tigers in China. He knew the Zero, he knew how it thought, and now, with the Corsair, he knew how to kill it. Misfits turned killers. VMF 214 wasn't supposed to be elite. It was made up of replacements, stragglers, pilots without permanent assignments, men who didn't quite fit anywhere else. But under Boyington's command, they became something else entirely. He drilled one idea into them: stay fast, stay high, stay alive. No turning fights, no heroics, no second chances. The Corsair gave them the advantage. Boyington taught them how to use it. Bougainville, the killing sky. September 16, 1943. Above Bougainville Island, 24 Corsairs, 50 Zeros rising to meet them. The Japanese came in numbers, confident, aggressive, the way they always had. But this wasn't 1942. The Corsairs climbed higher, held position, waited. Then, Boyington gave the signal: attack. The execution. They came out of the sun, fast, silent, invisible until the last second. The first dive shattered the Japanese formation. Zeros broke apart. Some climbed, some turned, some froze. All of them were exposed. Boyington made his pass. One burst, one kill. Climb, reset, dive again. Another and another. He didn't stay. He didn't chase. He killed and moved on. By the end of the engagement, 20 Japanese aircraft were gone. The Black Sheep, not a single loss. Boyington himself, 5 kills, an ace in a day. The formula for dominance. The Corsair wasn't just winning, it was redefining combat. The formula was simple. Altitude is life, speed is survival, firepower is final. Japanese pilots couldn't adapt fast enough. Every tactic they tried failed. They attempted coordinated attacks. The Corsairs broke them apart. They tried forcing low-speed fights. The Corsairs refused to engage. They tried attacking from behind. American pilots countered with defensive maneuvers like the thatch weave. Every move met with a counter. Every advantage neutralized. Rabaul under siege. The fortress at Rabaul had once been untouchable. Now it was under constant attack. Corsair-escorted bombers struck daily. Airfields were cratered, hangars burned, aircraft destroyed before they could even take off. Simpson Harbor became a graveyard of ships. Wrecks littered the water. The Japanese still had men, still had guns, still had aircraft, but they no longer had control of the sky, and without that, they had nothing. The death of experience. The real loss wasn't just aircraft, it was pilots. Japan's greatest strength had always been its aviators, highly trained, highly disciplined, elite. Now, they were dying faster than they could be replaced. Veterans with hundreds of combat hours, gone. Squadron leaders, gone. Instructors, gone. And in their place, boys. Pilots with barely enough training to survive takeoff, sent into battle against Corsairs. The result was predictable and brutal. The numbers don't lie. By early 1944, the numbers told the story clearly. Over 600 Japanese aircraft destroyed by Corsairs, fewer than 80 lost in combat, an 11-to-1 kill ratio, and rising. This wasn't parity, this wasn't competition, this was domination. The psychological collapse. Japanese pilots began to write about it, in diaries, in reports, in quiet conversations no one wanted to hear. One entry, recovered after the war, read, "We rise to meet them and fall before we can fight." Another, "We do not battle us, they execute us." The fear wasn't just physical, it was mental. The belief in superiority, gone. The belief in victory, gone. All that remained was survival. The Corsair becomes a weapon system. The aircraft evolved quickly, relentlessly. New variants improved visibility, increased firepower, expanded payload capacity. The Corsair became more than a fighter. It became a bomber, a ground attack aircraft, a ship killer. It could fight its way in, destroy the target, and fight its way out, all in one mission. No Japanese aircraft could match that versatility. Industry versus tradition. The deeper truth was becoming clear. This wasn't just about aircraft, it was about systems. The United States produced more planes, more pilots, better training, faster improvements. Japan could not keep up. While American factories produced hundreds of Corsairs monthly, Japan struggled to replace its losses. While American pilots trained for hundreds of hours, Japanese replacements went to war with barely a fraction of that. The gap widened every day. The end of the Zero era. The Mitsubishi Zero had once ruled the Pacific. Now it was obsolete. Not because it was poorly designed, but because the war had moved beyond it. Speed mattered more than maneuverability. Durability mattered more than agility. Firepower mattered more than finesse. And in every category, the Corsair dominated. Boyington's final mission. January 3, 1944. Over Rabaul, Boyington led another sweep, another mission, another fight. He shot down 2 more aircraft, his 26th and 27th victories. Then, everything went wrong. Enemy fighters, ground fire, too many hits, too much damage. His Corsair couldn't hold. He went down, captured, gone from the war. But the squadron didn't collapse. It kept fighting, kept winning, because by then, the system was bigger than the man. The sky belongs to the Corsair. By 1944, the transformation was complete. Japanese daylight operations stopped entirely. They flew at night, or not at all, because during the day, the Corsair owned the sky.